All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. We are in for a treat today, and although she is far away, one of my absolute favorite speakers to connect with is Dr. Jessica Sharp. So I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us again. I feel like I work you to death, but um, we love having you here to talk to us. So welcome to Mission West Virginia. Welcome back. It's been a few months since we've had a webinar, so we're excited to get these rolling again. So you can expect to see these coming out monthly again now. Um, just quickly, we're going to go over who Mission West Virginia is. Most of you probably know. Um, I'll just read off the slide. We're leading a statewide effort to promote positive futures for all kids in West Virginia. We work alongside families as they navigate West Virginia's foster care system and provide evidence-based life skills education to help teens envision and create positive futures. So as a result of our work putting kids first in collaboration with social services, school districts, private foster care agencies, and other nonprofits, future is looking brighter for West Virginia and our youth. We're excited for that. So we do that through two general ventures. One of them is Frameworks. And our Frameworks program helps offer support for people who are interested in foster care or kinship care, just to kind of navigate the system, either finding a placement agency or navigating the whole kinship side of things if that's where you are. So we have a lot of grandparents with their grandkids here, so we try to help them out as well. So if you're interested in fostering, please give us a call at 866-CALL-MWV, or you can call 304-512-0555. We would love to get you started on that path. So the Think program, which is actually sponsoring today's webinar, we are an evidence-based educational program in the schools in health classes in middle schools and high schools. We teach teen pregnancy prevention, healthy relationship education, some positive youth development. So we empower teens to make positive life choices through education, life skills, and coaching. Our program is evidence-based and helps the students we work with navigate the social emotional pressures all teens face as they develop. This includes building healthy relationships and healthy choices around drugs and alcohol and pregnancy prevention. So we do deliver our program in partnership with schools in 20 counties. We're vetted by district leaders, teachers, and other school leaders who are trained to work with the kids. The program's evidence-based curriculum has been shown to have a positive effect on preventing teen pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, or sexual risk behaviors. Our educators are continually trained on the most up-to-date information on trauma, sexual health, and high-risk behaviors. Our management team does on-site observations of our educators regularly to ensure fidelity is being followed. We also administer pre and post surveys, receive teacher feedback, hold team focus groups, and site satisfaction surveys, just to make sure that what we're doing is relevant and that it's effective. So we also offer workshops and trainings in addition to that, like this webinar today. Um, some of the things that we talk about could be talking to youth about sensitive or difficult topics hidden in plain sight, trauma, sexual assault prevention and consent, teen dating violence, and we do a whole lot more. Today's webinar is eligible for social work CEUs, so it should be 1.5, and you will get a certificate. This one says processed within 72 business hours. We are closed tomorrow to celebrate Easter, so it'll be next week before these certificates are processed. So also there will be a link to a short survey when this presentation ends, and you'll also receive one in an email afterwards as well. It's a quick survey. Really what we're trying to just get is how many of you are parents who were on this presentation today. If you could just answer one of those, you do not have to do, if you receive it in the email, you don't have to complete it twice, but we really appreciate your participation in that. Now our speaker, we're getting to the good stuff. So Jessica Sharp Sidey is the founder and chief educator. Well, I'm losing my page here. Of Sharp Brain Consulting. She regularly speaks about various topics related to the brain and leadership. Sharp Brain Consulting is a brain-based organizational development firm. They walk alongside organizations to improve their outcomes. Jessica is passionate about brain education, empowering underserved and minority communities, and diverse representation. In addition to leading SBC, she also serves as the Director of Development and Recruitment for the YMCA of Greenville's Teen Services Branch. Jessica is committed to improving her community. I'm lost. I'm sorry. Jessica is committed to improving her committee. She does this through her involvement in various organizations, including the Greenville Chamber, the Junior League of Greenville, and the United Way of Greenville. She's a Leadership Greenville graduate and Diversity Fellow with the Riley Institute. She has been recognized for her work to better the Greenville committee. Is it supposed to say community? I'm sorry. Okay, community. My apologies. Jessica has an
No, it's on
MPA.
me.
Oh, sorry. Jessica has an MPA from the University of Missouri in PsyD and leadership psychology from William James College. And I'm so excited to have you here. I'm going to turn it over. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. I'm happy to be here. And I realized, and honestly, I think I realized this like last week. I was like, I don't think that have sent Hillary an updated bio. So I actually am now in Houston, Texas.
Oh,
And that's on me, not on you, because I think I'm like, we're in such a routine these days. So
I
I
was
am
getting
now in
ready to say,
Houston.
I'm sorry if this is incorrect because I don't
No, it's
know.
fine.
This could have been from 2 years ago and I just recopied it. Oh,
I think so, but I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of context, a little bit more about who I am in just a second anyway.
please do.
But I'm going to share my screen, which I think means you'll need to stop sharing real quick. But and what you'll see as y'all are logging in, folks are putting the organization that they're with. And let me make sure I share sound. Okay. And perfect. Okay. Want to make sure I'm sharing all the right screens. And because this is a webinar style, you all I can't see you anyway. So you don't need to have your cameras on. And I'm going to sort of try to keep up with the chat. What you'll see, I'm sort of giving you like context for this journey we're about to start together. So what I'll do for the most part is I'll sort of go back and forth between having my slides like this so that it's sort of, you can mostly see them and, you can see them. And actually doing in slideshow function. For whatever reason, I think maybe it's my computer. I don't know if it's just Mac, but Mac and Zoom seem to like not love each other. And so whenever I have my actual presentation up, I can't see the chat. And I like to sort of be able to. So that's why sometimes you'll be like, why isn't it like actually as a presentation? That's why. So today, I'll play it for now. What we'll be doing is I'm going to sort of take you on a journey. We're going to first sort of begin to talk about the behaviors that we sort of see in teenagers that we have experienced because we were all teenagers at some point. And then we're going to sort of really dig into some neuroscience, obviously, to talk about why those things are happening and to get a sense of what's going on that sort of makes these behaviors happen. And then we'll get really practical and I will provide two frameworks that will have both sort of a larger theory behind them, but also some very tactical things around how to make sure that we are best supporting our young people. And a little bit more about me. So as I mentioned, I'm in Houston and I still volunteer quite a bit in the community. But when I was in Greenville, I did a little bit in Houston. It's called Guardian ad Litem in South Carolina. It's called CASA here. As you all are probably experts on what the role of a CASA and a Guardian ad Litem are, but that's one of the volunteer roles that I had that was particularly meaningful. And I think that that experience is certainly helpful, both in the context of teens, but with this group in particular. And then I've worked with and sort of around young people, really primarily high school and a little bit of middle school for a number of years. So I was at the YMCA in Greenville for 2 go-rounds. I was at the Y. So I've worked with teenagers. I taught through Teach for America. So I sort of have a context of this age group in addition to doing consulting within the context of organizations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, like I said, sort of now go back and primarily go through the slides this way so that I can occasionally look up the chat and the Q&A. So I do want to, I'm going to utilize this Mentimeter. You all probably have used a version of a Mentimeter before. So the easiest way I think to utilize this function is you can do it on your phone or your computer. Normally when I'm not presenting, I just use my phone. And if you go to menti.com, that's just menti.com. It's up at the top of this screen. The screen that'll pop up, it'll have a little code, a box word code. And the code that you're going to put in is up here. And I'll put it in the chat as well. But you all have put this some in the chat, but just to help me, I I'd love to get a sense of who's in the room and your roles. And you may say either one of two things. These roles, none of them fit me at all, and then we're going to put you in the other category. But if you're like, this sort of fits, right? So maybe you're a school principal, then I would sort of put myself in the educator or school staff section. Or if you maybe are the executive director of a nonprofit, we're going to put you in that section. If you are a member, if you are, a foster parent, or, you are fostering a child, we're going to put you in that category, right? So sort of look through and decide which category feels like it, what role do you play essentially? And then just click one of those. Just like I said, so I can sort of get a sense of who's in the room. I know we're gonna have lots of social workers because you're getting credit for it, but if there's any other sort of folks, make sure you put that as well. So lots and lots of social workers, good. Mhm. Okay. Perfect. Okay, good. And you all can sort of continue to put this in. It feels like we're getting sort of a lot of, we've hit sort of a critical mass around social workers, which again makes a lot of sense. So that's just helpful for me, as so that I can make sure also that the examples I'm giving, they feel like they, make sense to you all. So we're seeing some stuff in the chat, lots of social work, foster family, victim advocate, psychologist, social worker. Okay, perfect. And then the last thing I'll say before I sort of fully dig into slides is there will be times where I'll probably ask you for some feedback in the chat. There are a lot of you all, which is actually a really good thing. So I may not sort of look at all of them. I'm going to do lots of skimming. But there are just times I want to sort of get feedback from you all. I think with a webinar, I think it's helpful to the extent possible to have some level of engagement, even if it's sort of quote just in the chat function. So I'm going to first sort of tell you a story, and then we're going to talk about some behaviors of young people. So I told you I've worked at the YMCA a few times. I've been there in a full-time capacity as an adult twice. But one of my first jobs with the YMCA in Greenville, South Carolina, is I was a teen camp counselor. So the way we defined that was it was middle school, and was working in the summer to have camp. And we at the time we were working 4 10-hour days, so it was quite a long day every single all the weeks, 10 weeks. But the thing that I was in college, the thing I kept just sort of thinking about, and that we would sort of laugh about, but that really I carried and thought about beyond that experience, was just the level of social disruption I feel like would happen all the time. It would sort of feel like one week everybody, these group of people are all friends, everything's happy, rainbows and butterflies, and then the next week something would happen, and then oh no, we're mad at each other, right? We're gonna not sit together at the lunch table. And so I sort of noticed a lot of that behavior. And then I just sort of would notice that it felt like they were doing things that didn't make any sense to me, and just as a college student. And the thing that I like sort of learned and realized over time is the more that I kept working with young people, the more that I realized that there were these consistent behaviors almost no matter where they lived, right? And so that to me meant there's something else going on here beyond just teenagers doing things that frustrate adults. And the last sort of the thing I'll also caveat and say is young people are wonderful. And I don't like to make sort of sweeping generalizations, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is like very, very much so sort of rooted in and supported by neuroscience. So know that I think young people are wonderful, but we certainly have ways that we can support them. So the first slide that I'll start with is really thinking about some of the behaviors that we're noticing. And this list could be long and long and long. I just sort of clumped them. And if you've ever seen the movie Turning Red, it's a Pixar movie, but it's on Disney Plus. It's came out a few years ago. I can't remember. It's about this girl, and she when she gets very emotional, when she has very big emotions, she turns into a panda. And it's very sort of, it's culturally relevant why she turns into a panda. And it's sort of funny because she tries really, really hard to like sometimes bottle up her emotions, but then whenever she's emotional, she's turns into a panda, right? So it's one of these like big themes of that movie, and it reminded me of a few different things that happen with young people. Because the other thing that I noticed happens, I'm going to put all of them up because I'm going to sort of bounce around, is at least in this movie, the other sort of trend is that her little peer group, her friends, the other three people you're seeing here, I mean, they are her people. They support her. I mean, they really, she's sort of it's almost like that's home base for her. She sort of keeps going back to them. So there are some themes in that movie that I thought, gosh, it's really, what we're seeing in young people. So, and if you can sort of put some in the chat, how often you're sort of seeing these behaviors with the young people that you're interacting with. But I know what I have seen, and certainly even what I experienced a little bit as a teenager, is increased risk taking. So I know, sort of depending on what role you're in, if you're a social worker and if you're a therapist, you might sort of hear young people describing things to you that feel like this. But young people are starting to take risks that they probably wouldn't have when they were a little bit younger, right? Maybe in middle school, and they're taking risks that, again, may or may not make sense to adults. So one of the themes I feel like in teenagers is we're seeing more risk taking behavior. The other thing that happens, and it really sort of starts around middle school and I think peaks in high school, is the power of the peer group increases quite a bit. And we're going to talk about why that happens. But what sort of begins to happen is all of a sudden, whoever their friends are, whatever friend group they have, that group becomes really, really, really important to them. And what that group sort of says and does, and how in which that group accepts them or doesn't, becomes really, really important. We're going to talk more about sort of why that is the case. The other trend that I think happens particularly in that like middle school, high school, probably, transitioning between middle and high school and into high school is young people are having big emotions. And you will not hear me call emotions good or bad, because I don't like to call them bad. I don't like to call them good either necessarily. But they are feeling emotions in a really big way. And we're going to sort of talk about how that shows up, and how sometimes those things together can create some problems. So one of the things I'll say is in the chat, if, I'll sort of, like I said, I'll go back and forth between it. But if you have some feedback, you can put it in now. So the things I'm saying are, love that movie. It's a great movie. I watched most of it yesterday because I knew I was going to talk about it today. But if there's this movie and another one that I'm going to tell you about. And if y'all are also off tomorrow, then you all can watch some of these movies. And the movie is called Turning Red. It's very cute. So again, we're seeing increased risk-taking behavior. That peer group, just really becomes important. My old boss at the YMCA, she's the executive director of a statewide youth and government program. She would always say, at this age group, your peer group sets your norm, right? So they are the group that sort of we all are saying, I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this based on my peer group, right? So let's start to talk about why some of these things are happening. So what's going on in the brain? I'm going to first give you like a general sort of overview and context, and then we're going to talk about some specific areas of the brain. And I always say I get very excited, and I love talking about the brain. So sometimes you're going to like see me get excited and sort of nerd out a little bit, but a few things to note about the brain. When we're born, we obviously sort of have a full brain. As our bodies grow, our brain gets a little bit bigger. And most of the sort of like actual physical development of the brain happens really by sort of like early to middle elementary school. But there's still all of those, like the way that we call them is like the folds in the brain. So if you sort of look the way, can't see it, but the folds in the brain, you all sort of can probably articulate that. Those things are still ebbing and flowing and evolving, and the connections in the brain, and things are sort of shifting over time. And there are a few periods in our life where we're going through quite a bit of development, and that sort of adolescence, really the way that we sort of have set up grades, right, and school, is that it happens sort of oftentimes around late middle school into early high school. That period of time there's so much brain development happening. And part of what's happening around that time is a process called pruning. So the brain has all sorts of stuff going on, right? And at some point, the brain sort of says, I need to limit some of the things happening, because if not, I cannot manage it. So around that time, things that we haven't used in our brain, we sort of start to get rid of, because our brain says, I don't actually need this skill or need to remember this or need to know how to do this, right? It's why if you have learned something before sort of this time, so like it's why one of the reasons why we encourage young people to learn second languages or third languages at an earlier age, because it's going to sort of follow them throughout, versus if you learn it a little bit and then you don't really use it, that's something that potentially might get pruned, might get gone, sort of go away. So I say that to say there's just all of these things that are happening because our brain is trying to sort of begin to settle in to how it's going to feel as an adult. So there's just so much brain development happening. I'm going to talk primarily about two systems, and I'm going to give you like a preview and then go deeper because I want to make sure it's sort of easy to follow. And then I'll also say one more thing. If you have specific questions, particularly if there's something that I've said that you don't understand, make sure you put it in the Q&A so it'll sort of flag to me to make sure at some point I check in with that. But the few parts of the brain we're going to talk about are first going to be the limbic system. And that's sort of in the back of your brain. So if you take your hands and put them on the back of your brain, like you're about to sort of lean back, that's sort of where that part of the brain is. It develops first. And what I mean by that is those connections, the sort of the way it works together, that part develops pretty early in life because that part of the brain is responsible for some pretty significant things in our life. So, the our breathing, sort of our body working, because the brain is part of the nervous system. So all of these things that are happening in the background that we need to have happen, those things are all controlled by the limbic system. So it's part of why that development happens so early. The limbic system, there are sort of many parts of it, but the real specific parts you're going to hear me talk about are primarily the amygdala, which I'll talk some about, and that's where emotions really live in the brain. I'll talk maybe this much about the hippocampus. As you can see on this picture, it's physically very proximate to the amygdala, and that has a big role in memory and learning, and they sort of play together because of their proximity. And then the last part of the brain that you'll hear me talk about and we'll talk about together is the prefrontal cortex. That's right here behind your forehead. And that's where sort of what we call our executive functioning tasks live. And I'll define those in several slides. But it's, attention, concentration, that sort of thing. So these parts of the brain in particular are also going through quite a bit of development and sort of adjustment throughout sort of the sort of adolescent timeframe. The other few things I want you to know about the brain in general that are, impact all of us is a few things. One, the brain is inherently a social organ. So what that means is that we are literally, Brene Brown says this, you'll hear me quote her at least one more time. But Brene Brown, who's a social worker, she is y'all's people, so you probably know her. But Brene Brown talks about, she says that we are hardwired for connection. And what she means is that the brain is, we are literally programmed to be with other humans. Sometimes you'll hear people say, particularly I feel like young people will say things like, I'm a loner, I don't want to, have anybody around, I don't want to be around anybody. And that always sort of is troublesome to me because we have to be around people. We have to have relationships. Now, the quantity is sort of up for debate, right? Some people really only need a few sort of people close to them. Some people, like a lot of people. But we are social beings, and a lot of our decisions are based on social things, right? And sort of social relationships. The other sort of thing I want to share with you, just again in general about the brain before we move any deeper, is that we are what are considered meaning making beings. And what I mean when I say that is that our brain likes to make sense of things. We don't like gaps of information. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like if we can't figure something out. We don't really like that necessarily. So our brains like to make sense of things. So a sort of very like concrete example is if you email, let's say I email Hillary. We email quite a bit. We work very, very well together. So let's say I email Hillary and she'll only respond super quick. And she doesn't respond within a few days. My brain, because it is different, because it always responds to me quickly, if she doesn't, my brain is going to say, this is different and this is something new and I need to make sense of it. And the other thing is, normally when we attach our own meaning, it's in conjunction to our own stuff, right? So I may say, I can't believe she's not responding to me, and it could be sort of a very flippant response. Or I can say, oh my goodness, I hope she's not mad at me, right? So, but essentially we're trying to make meaning of this thing that maybe Hillary accidentally pressed, she thought she responded, or she, left it unread or left it unread when she needed to leave it read, right? So I say that to say we, both young people and adults, we are attaching meaning to everyday actions all of the time, right? And those are going to be just a few things that I think are going to help as we sort of continue to lay the foundation for the brain. So as I go to the next slide, I'm going to quickly pull up the chat and just make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay, perfect. And all right. Oh, I moved it around, but don't worry. These slides are just for you, so it don't matter. Okay. So I want you to meet the limbic system. I've talked just a little bit about it. But if you look at that picture sort of up in the corner, it's a guard outside of a castle. the way that I often describe the limbic system is that it is your guard outside of your castle. It can be a Disney castle if you're really into Disney like I am. It can be the Hogwarts castle. It can be whatever castle you want it to be. But the amygdala, the limbic system, and the amygdala specifically are sort of the guards outside of your castle. And the limbic system is doing a few things, but the amygdala specifically, and this is where I'm really going to spend a lot of time, is on the amygdala. The amygdala is sort of looking around, scanning the environment and saying, am I safe? Is everything okay here? And then if we aren't safe, the amygdala, the guard, is going to act, right? So that's sort of this foundational thing that I want you to remember. But I'm going to go through the bullet points as well. One of the things to know about the limbic system, and again, specifically the amygdala, and the amygdala is sort of dug deep down in our brain. It's small, it's shaped like a walnut. It is the home of our threat response, and it is also the emotional center of the brain. And so most of you have probably heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response, especially if you're in social work. You've probably heard of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And I'll quickly go through those. When we are encountered with a threat, something that is scary to us, and I'll talk about that again in a second, but something that is scary, that is a threat, our brain is going to decide pretty quickly, our amygdala, what we're going to do about it. And either we're going to engage with the situation, we're going to fight, which can mean we're going to sort of start, yelling and, sort of being loud that way. We might actually aggressively go into fight, right? Go into a situation. But essentially we're going in to deal with whatever the thing is. The other option is to flee, right? We are getting out of here. One time when I was at the Y, we take students on a lot of conferences, and we took some young people on a service trip. And that year was, I don't know, it was a particularly interesting year. We had a lot going on, but we had one young person who she was being bullied by some of the other girls in the group, or some of the other young people in the group. And we just didn't sort of catch it fast enough. So it sort of escalated, I think, very quickly. And she sort of, I think, in the middle of it, realized, oh, this is about to be bad, and she left. We were in like a sort of a loft area, and she ran upstairs and stayed there for, I mean, probably 20 minutes. And my old boss, the executive director I mentioned, she had to physically go there, and she, for a little bit of time, she just like had to hug her, right? If you work with autistic kids, you know, like this idea of like bear hugging and like helping everybody's body feels good. And it took her brain and probably 30 minutes to sort of calm down after she had left and fled that situation, right? So flee is one of those potential responses. The other one is freeze. This happens most often when whatever the threat is just like, it is so intense that it overwhelms our nervous system, and our body's like, I don't even know what to do with this, so I'm out of here. Oftentimes that's going to look like sort of staring, maybe with like glass glazed over eyes, or you might pass out if it's just too much. And then the other response is a fawn response. We see that most often in folks who who've experienced repeated abuse. And that response is sort of a desire to fix whatever the situation is, in an attempt to be safe again, right? But all of that lives in the amygdala, and that response comes from the amygdala. The other thing to know about this part of the brain, the amygdala specifically, it's where our core emotions live. So the other movie that, if you haven't seen, put it on your list, is Inside Out. It's also a Pixar movie, so it's on Disney Plus. And it has a sequel, y'all, and I'm so excited about it. It's coming out this year. But in that movie, they actually do a very good job of sort of articulating what's happening in the brain. And I'm spending a lot of time on this slide because it sort of, these next few slides really create the foundation for a lot of the rest of our content and time together. So when we are born, we come to the world with 6 core emotions. Those 6 are what you see on this picture plus one more. So it's surprise, which is not here, because I don't know how in the world Pixar would make a character be surprised for 90 minutes. But surprise, anger, fear, joy, disgust, and sadness. And those 6 emotions we come to the world with. And until our brain sort of, and until we are really sort of taught otherwise, those emotions really dictate a lot of what we do. So in the movie, it's cute. The main character's name is Riley. And so we sort of go back and forth in the movie between watching Riley live her life, and we go back and forth between that and her brain. And so what's happening is her emotions are sort of dictating what's going on. Like there's even one point where she gets broccoli pizza, and disgust and anger sort of pop up real quick because they don't like it. So disgust is like, I don't like it, and then she like I think spits it out or does something. I haven't seen it enough in a year or two, and then anger pops up and is like, oh, I'm so mad that we're having to have broccoli on pizza, right? And so we're having these sort of emotional outbursts that comes from the amygdala. The other thing to note about the amygdala is, in addition to it being where our threat response lives, where our emotions live, again, particularly those six that we come to the world with, every other emotion, you'll hear me say this again, every single other emotion has to be taught or modeled for us. If not, we don't even have words for it. And the other thing to know about the limbic system, it plays a big role in how our body manages and responds to stress. And again, part of that is because of how the amygdala and the emotions, and that our body wants to try to manage stress in a way that isn't necessarily too taxing on us. And so the limbic system plays a big old role in that. The other thing to note about the amygdala and the limbic system is that it moves quickly. Your amygdala will sort of make an assessment, make a decision within milliseconds of something happening. And your amygdala is very powerful. So what happens is something happens, we are encountered with what feels like a threat. And within milliseconds, our limbic system, our back brain is what I sometimes call it, the emotional center of our brain is deciding how to react. And oftentimes it's potentially before we even consciously know what's going on, unless we work on it, which don't worry. But this is sort of, left to our own devices. So the thing to know about the amygdala and the limbic system is that it's, sort of constantly looking around to make sure that we're safe. It's where the emotions live in our brain, and it moves very quickly. So what I'm going to do is introduce one more part of the brain to you, and then I'm going to tell you how they work together and what's happening in adolescence. But I want to make sure you sort of got a full context first. And then sort of per usual, I'm sort of very quickly checking. Yes, a sequel, and anxiety is one of them. Y'all are already in the chat. You're already on top of it. I'm very excited about it. Somebody says they pass out when they get fight or flight, right? It's like, oh, I can't even do it. Okay, perfect. The other questions. Okay. So that's the limbic system, and your amygdala, or sort of, again, the amygdala is part of the limbic system. So I'm going to introduce one more part of the brain, then like I said, I'm going to put it all together. So your prefrontal cortex, it's behind your forehead. I often call it the queen of your castle. It can be a king if you want it to be, but in my world, it tends to be a queen. And that part of the brain is the part of the brain where, as I mentioned, our executive functioning skills live. Sometimes I joke and say it's the part of the brain that helps to make us adults. This is also the part of the brain that is different than any other animal. That the other animals don't have this part of the brain, other mammals. And you'll hear me say this at least one more time. This part of the brain, actually, I'm gonna ask you a question. I'm gonna not give it to you, I'm gonna ask you. So I'm gonna explain what this is, and I'm gonna sort of give you a little quiz in the chat, see how much we came in here knowing. So your executive functioning skills, I'm going to talk about them, and then I'm going to talk about how these two parts of the brain work together. There are several set of skills that live in this part of the brain, and I'm going to start with one. It's impulse control. It's sort of this brown, and then I'm going to go around. So the first skill that lives in this part of the brain is impulse control, right? So this idea of thinking before we act. Emotional control. So, we also might call this emotional regulation, but the ability to sort of feel our feelings, but not have them fully dictate what our actions are. Flexible thinking, so adjusting behavior to unexpected changes, like, oh, this thing happened unexpectedly. Oh, okay, let me adjust. Working memory, so that's keeping key pieces of information in your brain. The way that I sometimes describe this is, how at this point, every single website requires you, when you log in, they're like, I'm going to text you a code, or I'm going to email you a code. I don't know why, but they all do it. If you struggle to remember that code back and forth, you might have a working memory issue, because it's just these like sort of little bits of key information. Self-monitoring, which is also really related to self-awareness and sort of how am I doing in the moment? How do I feel, right? And potentially how am I showing up with others? The ability to plan and prioritize to meet goals. So both like forward planning, like I have a project due in a month, so I'm going to do a little bit this week, next week, the next week. And then also prioritizing to say, I have 3 tasks. Which one is first most important, second, third? And then task initiation. So that's taking action on tasks to get started. So if you sit down and you're about to start your workday, are you able to like immediately just start on a task? Or do you sort of, get distracted and then have to remind yourself to start this actual task? And then the last one is organization. So that's keeping track of things physically, right? Do I know where all of my things are? But also mentally being able to keep track of information and sort of make sense of information. So a few things to note about the executive functioning skills. They all sort of work together, and again, they live in this part of the brain. The other thing that I think is helpful to know is we do what we call our rational sort of logical thinking from this part of the brain, right? That because all of these things, the ability to plan into the future, prioritize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the question I'm going to ask you on y'all social worker, so you actually probably know like what the actual answer is. But yes, and Stephanie, keep your Disney Plus subscription as long as you can. But what age do you think that the prefrontal cortex, what I call the front brain, but this part of your brain, what age do you think it finishes its development? 25 with 4 exclamation points. 26, 26 to 30, 25-ish, mid-20s. See, I knew you all would know because you're social workers and you know all the things. Males 40, they are saying that's crazy. 36, 25-ish. I think 25-ish might be the actual best answer that there is. And okay, perfect. So I asked a question about trauma. I want to talk about that too. Still waiting. So you all, of course, know the answer. That part of the brain does not finish its development until, again, depending on which researcher you ask, early to mid to late 20s. The most recent numbers I've been reading are mid to late 20s. In one slide, I'm going to talk some about, I'm going to talk sort of quickly about poverty and trauma and how they impact the brain, because they absolutely impact the brain in this way as well. The other thing to note, and I'll again talk a little bit about it in a few slides, but so neurodivergence is this umbrella term that includes a myriad of things, including ADHD, autism, Tourette, sort of these different developmental challenges. I don't know what word we're using these days. I have ADHD, so I never know what other people are calling what's going on in my brain. But one of the things to note is that these executive functioning skills are also a challenge for folks who have ADHD, almost potentially regardless of age development, in my experience, both because I got diagnosed late. So I've been doing a lot of research on ADHD in the past probably 6 years. If you got ADHD, if you are a part of the neurodivergent community, that's how I think we're currently calling ourselves. You may struggle with some of these skills almost regardless of age. And the more stressed you are, at least in my actual experience, the more you're going to struggle with these. So that's just sort of an additional thing to note. So I'm now going to sort of and it does vary depending on the age, to Shannon's point. And 2 other things. It does vary based on the age. And they're also saying it is gender. I've read some places where there are some gender differences. And I love my ADHD brain is perfectly broken. And people are answering questions within the chat, so that's perfect. So an OCD is one I would imagine it probably potentially falls into either neurodivergence or I think maybe still a mental health condition, but you all are social workers, so you all know the DSM-5 certainly more than I do. But I would probably just sort of fit it under neurodivergence, just a different way of thinking and viewing the world. So I'm going to now talk about again how they work together. So as I've mentioned, we know for sure, you all know for sure, the prefrontal cortex doesn't finish its development until our mid-20s. Well, this back brain, the limbic system, that part of the brain is pretty developed, right? Certainly by middle school and high school. And again, this part of the brain, doesn't develop until our early or mid-20s. Now, the thing to know, I'm going to tell you sort of 2 things about these 2 parts of the brain and how they work together. So the first thing to note is the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and sort of the limbic system, really amygdala, they have what I often call a seesaw relationship. Sometimes they sort of like, sometimes you get it just perfectly so on a seesaw, 2 kids on a seesaw. I guess 2 adults could be, I don't know, I've never tried it, but you can sort of be balanced and both sides are good. But if one side of the seesaw is all the way up at the top, the other one is sort of down at the bottom. And the way that I talk about these 2 parts of the brain is that when one is fully activated and fully alert, unless something external happens, right, the other part of the brain is going to be not dormant because it's all working at the same time. Every part of our brain is working all of the time, but it's going to sort of be a little bit sort of further back. I'm going to give you some concrete examples about what that would look like. So many of you have heard of, you might even teach about this idea of an amygdala hijack. With littles, we sometimes call it like flipping our lid, right? So it's sort of a good low model for the brain. Something happens, right? There's a threat, something has gone on, and our amygdala, in an attempt ultimately to keep us safe, has taken over the rest of our brain and body, right? In those situations, sometimes whether it's happened to you or others, people may say things like, "Oh, I don't even remember doing that," or "I don't know why I did that," right? Because the part of their brain that is sort of programmed to help them regulate is not really there. Sometimes I'll describe it as like when we have an amygdala hijack, it's almost like your queen is in a of your castle. She's like in a panic room. She don't even know what's going on. So she's gonna come out and be like, "Oh, what has happened? What's going on here?" Right. Um, and you might remember it later because of the hippocampus and the amygdala and their physical proximity, right? Because they are friends. You might remember parts of it, but again, you don't have the ability to rationally think. The other thing that sometimes happens, and especially if you are really into a task that requires your front brain, right? So like maybe you're working on a project, or I graduated about 2 years ago. So there were times when I was doing research where I'd be so deeply in thought that the rest of my back brain, it's still doing its normal sort of like observing, looking around, making sure I'm safe, but it's not primed for attack, right? It's just sort of sitting around. And until something happens that makes me feel like I am unsafe, it's going to be relatively calm, right? Again, until something happens. So again, the thing to note is because that back brain, right, the limbic system develops so early, our young people, baseline before anything else, they're sort of primed to have more emotional outbursts or sort of more big reactions because the part of the brain that is literally designed to help calm that down isn't even fully developed yet, right? And so it's going to be harder for that part of the brain to sort of come up and do its little thing because it's not fully, it's just not had enough of its development yet, right? So again, that idea of a seesaw relationship, which I'll probably mention again, but again, because that part of the back part of the brain is so it's so activated, right? Because it's fully developed. It is potentially more difficult for our young people to do all of these things, to do the planning, the task initiation, the organizing, the impulse control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll talk a little bit more about, I'm going to go through, I think, two more slides that talk about some other things happening in the brain. And I'll sometimes sort of point back and say, this thing that I'm talking about now, this is why this thing happens. So again, the two of these parts sort of working together like a seesaw. So again, I know to make sure I'm not missing anything. Because sometimes I just start talking about the brain and I get all excited. So again, seesaw, this part of the brain doesn't finish developing until early, mid to late 20s. And I'm actually going to adjust and talk now a little bit now about sort of poverty, trauma, additional, what I sometimes call environmental factors that impact the brain. So what we know for sure, the research is very, very clear on this, is folks who are living in poverty, and this is both individuals who have lived in poverty for some sort of an extended amount of time. My dad grew up in Alabama, and he lived in some pretty extreme poverty his whole life, right? So an extended period of time. Or folks who, potentially because the research is a little bit less clear on that. If you're somebody who, especially in adolescence, has not lived in poverty, but you've sort of, the way our world is set up, unfortunately, is one bad thing can happen to a family, and they're living in poverty. But that's a different argument for a different time. But if you sort of dip down and all of a sudden now you are actively living in poverty, you're carrying that type of stress, it also is going to impact the brain. It's a little muddier, but that. And then the other thing that will impact the brain that I'll talk about because they show up in very similar ways is experiencing repeated trauma. Now, you all as social workers are the experts, I think, on trauma, but I don't know that anybody who is adjacent to the foster care system would say that there are not an obscene amount of parts of the foster care system that inherently create trauma, right? The idea of just like being ripped away from your home in and of itself, that is a traumatic experience, right? I had one case that is sort of still lingering, unfortunately, in South Carolina. And it just felt like, my sweet girl, she, every time it felt like she was building some momentum and she was maybe going to go home, something happened, right? So that level of like uncertainty and not knowing and not having any voice in what's going on, those are some pretty traumatic things, right? So, I'm going to specifically talk about those two things. What we know for sure is that poverty and trauma, they impact the brain in a lot of ways, but they make the amygdala and the limbic system more attuned to threats. So basically what's happening is that because of the way in which like living in trauma and certainly living in poverty, especially repeat like living in poverty for a long time, the way it sort of impacts our body, socially, et cetera, is that the amygdala becomes basically more susceptible to a threat response. So things that may feel small to sort of anybody, to somebody who isn't in one of those situations, to the amygdala of somebody who's living in poverty or experiencing repeated trauma, small things can feel big, right? Because your amygdala is sort of jittery, your guard is like sort of already pumped up, ready for a fight, if you will, right? The other thing that's happening is that there's the sort of gray matter in the front part of your brain. It is not developing in the same way. Those connections are not as sort of tight. The thing you will for sure hear me say is that the brain has the ability to change. We can change our brains at any point. So anything I'm telling you, there's sort of a strategy around working through it. But sort of all of that to say, if we've got young people who are, especially again, who are in foster care, they might be a little bit more, their emotions might be bigger, the presentation of those emotions might be bigger, the way that they are presenting might feel more intense, and I'm air quoting that on purpose, but it's because their amygdala is just so much more sort of on guard, and priming for something, because again, all of it is about keeping us safe. And the part of our brain that is designed to say, hold on, wait a minute, let's calm down, it's already not developed. And in addition to that, that general lack of development, there's some differences in how it develops. So I want to make sure you understand that too, that particularly the young people that we're working with, that you all are working with, are even more susceptible to some of the difficult things attached to brain development. So two more slides. Two more slides about the brain. Let me just check the chat real quick. Okay, perfect. And then I think I actually asked, so two of these questions, it's perfect. So two of the questions that you all have asked, I'm gonna hit on a little bit later because it's about essentially solutions, right? And we're gonna talk about that. So I'm gonna make sure I don't, all right, I'll go back to them. Perfect. So wait, there's a little more. So you all, I'm certain that you all have heard the term neurotransmitters and you know what a neurotransmitter is and are. But neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that carry information from one part of the brain to another. Essentially, they are sort of, and you can see it in the picture, they're these little things here that just pass information back and forth. And those neurotransmitters impact how we think, they impact how we feel, and they impact how we act. And during adolescence, during this period of time, there's some changes in three of them in particular. So the first one is melatonin, which you all probably have heard of. I'm sure you have actually. So melatonin essentially helps us sleep. At its core, it helps us sort of, it helps us to regulate like daytime and nighttime. And it sort of helps us prepare for sleep. So if you've been around a teenager recently, you know that at least most of them, not all of them, because all of them don't do anything all the same, but most of them are not necessarily excited about going to sleep early, right? I think teens perpetually probably undersleep. Well, part of that is because the change that's happening from a melatonin perspective in the brain of adolescents is that the way that the change impacts their sort of the brain is it shifts their circadian rhythm just a little bit, and it makes it more on a 24-hour circadian rhythm versus what a 12-hour, what sort of a lot of other people have. So what's happening is, because, and I will say this is my experience, I feel I sometimes feel like a perpetual teenager as somebody who has ADHD every so often, but what happens is mornings are a little bit harder for them, and they're just not as awake in mornings, and they want to stay up to 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and they feel like they can, right? Because their bodies are shifting, and the way that their bodies are processing sleep is different. So that's a specific thing that's happening in the brain of teenagers. The other thing that's happening is their serotonin is impacted. And I'm going to read most of this definition that came straight from APA, the American Psychological Association. So serotonin is a common neurotransmitter in the brain and the central nervous system. And serotonin plays roles in a lot of things: emotional processing, mood, appetite, sleep, pain processing, reflux regulation. Levels of serotonin correctly correlate negatively with aggression. So if you've got lower levels of serotonin, it's going to impact, it's going to negatively be related to aggression. And the release of serotonin may also help promote sleep. Serotonin you also may have sort of heard of or know about because it sometimes people call it the happy hormone. It is one that if you are somebody who has has anxiety or depression, that is what they say, right, is that your serotonin is potentially low. So what's happening in the brain of our sweet teens is that their serotonin is also shifting, and essentially the way it shows up is that it's lower, right? So they are, you might see them, and attached to hormones too, you might see them be a little sadder, right? Or just sort of not as happy, or they might struggle with some of these other things that serotonin helps with. So things like pain processing, mood, appetite, etc. And then the last thing that's happening with adolescents in terms of these neurotransmitters is dopamine is having a whole experience. So dopamine does a few different things in our brain. At the core of it, we call it the reward sort of part of our brain. It's activated when sort of fun, exciting things happen, like when folks play video games and like they, I guess I'm not a gamer, right? But when they increase levels and that sort of thing, right? You might get a dopamine hit. If you get a gift, especially if it's unexpected, you might get sort of like a dopamine hit. It feels like a little like, oh, like a little happy sort of like high in your brain. Dopamine also plays quite a role in an attention sort of regulation. So folks whose brain processes dopamine differently. So my ADHD friends, that this includes us. It can be difficult to sort of engage in like attention, like a sort of like a task initiation is really the best way to describe it. But then also to sustain activity can be difficult as well. It's why sometimes, again, teenagers as well as adults with ADHD, we may struggle to do things that feel boring to us. Like, I don't really want to do that. A task that doesn't feel exciting can feel like, oh, it's almost like physically painful to have to do it. And for the sake of this presentation, I won't get into like the actual science of how dopamine works in the brain of teenagers as well as ADHD folks. But the way that I think about it is like hungry, hungry hippo. And it's sort of like we don't have enough dopamine, and it starts here, particularly unrelated to ADHD, it starts here. Like we don't have enough dopamine. And when we get it, it goes through very quickly, right? So young people are also more susceptible to like feeling bored and just not having the ability to like, or it feels harder for them to do a thing that isn't exciting for them. So that is a thing that's going to happen, as well as this idea of reward. Like it can feel like sometimes like there's nothing that sort of gets them excited, right? Because this is happening. So sort of in one more slide, but I'm gonna go through it very, very quickly. Uh-oh. And then, like I said, I'm gonna go through this side pretty quickly and sort of summarize all the brain things, and then we'll move on to some strategies. So I've already told you the brain is a social organ, right? And you all have seen, you probably see this, right? The way that sort of socially young people engage. So there is a changing relationship that happens with parents and guardians. So what the science says, and what probably many of us have practically seen, is that sort of around this time, young people start to shift, right? So in like elementary school, parents, grown-ups, guardians, grandparents, whoever sort of the grown-ups in your life are, you really, most kids, I think they sort of like them, they listen to them. It's like, they might get mad, whatever, but there's a good relationship. So really starting around middle school, high school, that begins to shift. And ultimately part of it is sort of a good thing, because we want young people to be able to be adults, right? And to be functioning adults. So if they fully rely on, every single thing their parents say, and don't at some point sort of get the ability to think some ways for themselves, to sort of shift a little bit, it's going to be difficult when they're 35. They're going to, maybe be more prone to do things like, live at home, et cetera, which is fine if you want to do that. But anyway. So we're sort of shifting that relationship, and you all probably, especially if your parents have seen it. I remember when this happened with me and my parents, where it's like all of a sudden what your friends are doing is really starting to become sort of the bar that you set of like, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to engage over here. The things that your parents say may become more frustrating to you, right? You're sort of starting to pull away, right? So there's a shift in that relationship. Social exclusion feels particularly intense. So because we're social beings, social exclusion actually always is painful, or most of the time it's painful, even as adults, right? If the people who are your people, your group, if they exclude you, that's difficult. But because of all of this development that's happening, and because of this idea of the changing relationship with parents, social exclusion, particularly now, is very intense. So when young people are like, oh, my friends didn't let me sit at the lunch table, that feels intense to them. And what the neuroscience says is, because we're social beings, if you sort of put some brain equipment on somebody, and look at look at the data, which I have done, what'll happen is when we are in physical pain, parts of our brain are activated. When we have social pain, particularly when it's approximate, like a partner, a family member, someone that's close to us, the same parts of the brain light up. So we oftentimes feel social pain, social exclusion in a very, very similar way that we feel physical pain. So again, that social exclusion, it feels really intense because the brain processes it that way. So, sort of to summarize all the things happening in the brain of our sweet young people right now, is that their limbic system, their amygdala, their back brain is fully developed. So they are feeling big feels, right? They are more likely to be impulsive. That they're sort of ready to be down for anything, right? They are also, I mean, their friend groups, their peer groups are really, really sort of dictating what their norms are. The part of the brain that is saying, hey, oh my goodness, don't do that, calm down. It, potentially depending on their age, may not even fully be sort of there yet. Their queen is still an infant. And then also there's these changes in, again, melatonin, which is impacting their sleep. And last time I checked, lack of sleep will impact your mood, right? So melatonin, serotonin, that's impacting their mood, and dopamine. So there's just so many things sort of happening in and around their brains, that at least for me, when I started to understand this, it helps me to have a level of sort of patience, right, around their behaviors and to not be as frustrated with them. But in my experience, it also has helped me, and I'm about to sort of transition to helping you do this. It helped me to create some tactics around supporting young people because I had a better understanding of what was happening and why it was happening. So I'm going to check the chat real quick before we sort of move along too much more. Yes, is that why addiction is so prevalent with ADHD? Yes, because most drugs, especially like the illicit drugs, they're going to increase dopamine, right? And again, hungry hippo over here, like our brains need more dopamine, and sort of almost like we can't get enough. I'm glad it's helping you understand your teen with ADHD as well. Okay, perfect. And then I'm going to just check the Q&A one more time. Perfect. And I've answered that question, Shannon. Great. And then, like I said, there's a few more that I'm going to sort of answer when we get a little bit closer to the end. So make sure I got all my notes. So what are we going to do about all of these things, right? All of these shenanigans with the young people and their sweet, sweet brains. So I'm going to go through, and like I said, I'm going to share with you really two sort of like frameworks and I think ways of thinking and acting and supporting young people that also think some of these things can help adults regardless of how their brain functions. And so I'm going to first talk about, I'm doing the wrong thing, emotional regulation. And I'm going to play this because it's got animation. So many of you probably know emotional regulation, and of itself it makes sense, right? The ability to regulate one's emotions. But it is emotional regulation is a skill that lives in the prefrontal cortex and the front part of the brain. And it's a skill that young people really like fully have to be taught and modeled, partly because it doesn't develop until mid, early to late 20s, right? So if you're also in your 20s or you have coworkers who are in your 20s, and sometimes they do things that you're like, that doesn't fully make sense. 20 folks are 20 struggling a little bit with emotional regulation. Also, the sort of big caveat and star I feel like I need to forever say now is we are still dealing with the impacts of COVID on the brain. And I might talk a little bit more about that in 2 or 3 slides. But our brains are sort of, we're all struggling, I think, a little bit more to regulate our emotions. But again, emotional regulation is just the ability to regulate your emotions. And it doesn't mean that you're not able to feel and process them. It means actually we are equipping you with the ability to say, oh, I can feel this emotion. I can feel sad, angry, happy, joyful, etc. But it doesn't have to fully dictate what I do, because with our young people in particular, because of the brain development we just talked about, they are much more susceptible to, thinking about this example from Inside Out with the pizza, to say, this thing has happened. I am so disgusted and mad about broccoli on pizza, and now I'm going to react, versus I'm very frustrated about this broccoli on this pizza, but I'm not going to have an outburst, right? The other thing I'll say that I sometimes say, and I think it might be helpful here, is two things one about fear and one about anger. Anger is what oftentimes we call a secondary emotion. And so what that means is that there's normally something underneath anger. So sometimes what will happen is like something makes you sad and then you're angry, or something makes you disgusted and then you're angry, right? So oftentimes there's something underneath anger. The other thing that I want to share, because I think it's important too, and I meant to share it earlier, but I forgot, is this as a note about fear. So in her book, Atlas of the Heart, it's Brene Brown's latest book. It's about emotions. She outlines 87 emotions. John couldn't have named 87 emotions before I read this book, but it is fantastic. If you work with anybody, which means all of us, it's a good book to read. But she calls fear, and she calls it negative, which is okay because she can do what she wants. But fear is a negative, short lasting, and high alert emotion. So I know it's a little off because I talked about emotions earlier, but we're going to probably talk about fear again. And so I want to sort of put that out there, that fear is high alert, and combine it with the amygdala and combine it with a prefrontal cortex that isn't fully developed. When young people are in particular have fear, are scared, their reactions may feel even more intense because fear is a high alert emotion. And then the last thing I'll say about fear before I fully dig back into emotional regulation is that because we're social beings and because social exclusion is such a big deal to us, fear, our brain interprets social fear just like we do physical fear. So if I'm driving down the road and a car stops abruptly in front of me, my limbic system, as long as my amygdala is going to stop, because that would present a potential physical threat, a physical fear, right? But if I am in a group of people and one of them has decided she's done with me, that is also going to potentially feel like something that's like creating fear in me. So in short, emotional regulation is important. So there's a really great book I love called Brain Hacks. It's really made for folks with ADHD, but it just has a lot of good information about the brain. And so I like her definition of emotional regulation. It refers to our ability to manage our emotional responses to things by bringing ourselves down from a high or up back from a low. So if we have an emotion that makes us feel like, it's like a big emotion, we're sort of having a big reaction, the ability to like, come back down. Or if we're feeling really low, really sad, really, the ability to come back up. And again, I think this is important, especially for our young people, because they are feeling their emotions in a really, really big way. So to support them and having the ability to sort of find a way to integrate their emotions into their life a little bit more than this, big emotion, big reaction. I think that's going to be a really big skill, especially for our young people who are in foster care, because unfortunately there are a lot of opportunities for them to have really big emotions and for them to have things that happen to them that make them emotional. So I'm going to give you three sort of tactical tools around emotional regulation. And then we're going to jump to another sort of framework that we'll spend a little bit more time on. So one of the things that I have been really energized by, and I really in some ways credit Brene and this book, is the ability to identify and name emotions. And there's a few reasons why that's important. In social psychology, there's this, and in the brain, and I won't go too much into it for the sake of this presentation, but there's a part of the brain that's a part of your larger cortex sort of system that is called the brain's braking system. There's a social psychologist who talks quite a lot about it. And essentially what happens is when we have the capacity to name how we are feeling and say, oh my gosh, I feel really sad, or I feel really angry, or I feel really frustrated, and I think it's because we're meaning making beings, right? I think that ability to say, oh, this is how I'm feeling, and I can now make meaning of it, and I can decide what to do about it, it activates that part of the brain. So essentially what happens is, because it's part of the cortex, it helps us to sort of can help regulate the limbic system and the activity in our limbic system, because this part of the brain is now engaged. Because a lot of these tactics and strategies I'm going to talk to you about, they are designed to, and I think I even write it down, I have it somewhere on one of these slides, but designed to help increase activity in your prefrontal cortex, decrease activity in your limbic system, and to the extent possible, to create as much space between stimulus, the thing that happens, and your reaction. Because if we can create space, you can allow this part of your brain to engage. The front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, is also like where your values live, right? So the ability to make a decision and say, I am proud of how I showed up with that decision, all that stuff lives up here, right? So the goal is to create as much space as possible. And it is helpful when we can identify and name emotions. And we can model that and work with young people to, asking them questions and sort of modeling that for them and teaching them. I'm a big fan of teaching young people things like this and saying, if we can work with you to name your emotions, that will help your brain feel better. And so if you're, as you're working with young people, helping them, asking them questions to help them identify and help work with them to identify, this is actually how I feel, right? And some of them may come to you immediately and say, I'm mad, right? And they may, be able to articulate it very quickly. But even if we can sort of drill down to understand, like, is this the only emotion we're feeling? Because sometimes we're feeling more than one, right? Because again, if we're mad, we're feeling more than one. I'm experiencing this situation where with the organization I volunteer with locally, I volunteer with the Junior League at an international level and the Urban League locally. And I'm dealing with a situation here that I vacillate all of the time between being upset and angry. And sometimes I am upset and angry at the exact same time, right? So sometimes there's more than one, but being able to get to a point where we can identify it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do anything with it. But one really important skill is to be able to say, this is how I'm feeling right now. Because we also can't do anything. James Baldwin said a version of this. We can't really do anything about our emotions if we can't even articulate what they are, right? The other thing I'll say, and y'all are social workers and therapists, so you probably already are in the habit of doing this, but there, the emotion wheel, there's a bunch of versions of it depending on, I think the Gottman Institute has a good one, but there's a bunch of them. It can be a really helpful tool for young people because it has a bunch of actual words, and all the emotion wheels I've seen start with the 6 at the core. So they'll say anger, and then all of these emotions that sort of stem from anger, and joy, and all of these things that stem from joy. So providing that as a concrete tool can also help your young people to sort of articulate, here's how I'm feeling. And I already said this, but create as much space as you can between emotion and reaction. And the APA has the CDC, excuse me, has a few ideas. There's Hillary, I hope this is okay, but I'm gonna send a few. There's a few quick like resources and links that I kept like sort of circling back to as I was creating this that I will send to you, Hillary, and you can send them to everybody or whoever, however you want to send them, but I'm gonna send you some stuff. And one of them is actually this link to the CDC. It has a really good web page about it's created for parents, but I think it's great for grown-ups, as any grown-up who's working with the young people, ways to help them, to help support their emotions. But some ways that we can create space between emotion and reaction. And this is for us as well as them. So if you are emotional and you're trying to support your whoever you're working with, you might need to do this as well. Taking a few deep breaths. I won't go into it for the sake of time, but deep breathing has tremendous benefits to the brain, and it helps decrease activity in the limbic system, increase activity up here. Shifting your attention to thinking about something else can be especially important if you've got like, if you have a really, really big emotion, you just need to sort of bring it down a little bit. Sort of being able to shift your attention is one of the neuroscience ways that I read about in school as well. Going to the bathroom and washing your hands. I find that sometimes in really high stressful situations, if you're able to just physically leave for a second, and do something different that can either be distracting or can help you think, that can be a helpful thing to process with young people, especially because for most teens, and I would assume, at least in my experience, this is certainly true for young people in foster care. It is exceptionally true for young people who are not in the majority. So they're not white, they're not, they're living in poverty, like young people who have been a part of what we would call marginalized communities. Their ability to react and have big emotions is different because the world doesn't really allow them to, not in the same way. So the ability for them to take a step away for a second and come back can be really helpful. And then a few other things, taking a drink of water can help because it's also just like it requires like it takes a few seconds, right? But it can also, again, sort of help you calm down. And then going outside or going for a walk can also be helpful. So again, creating a list, and you can take this list, you can create your own list, but creating some real tangible things that say, how can something happen? Okay, let's create as much space as we can. And then the last thing is, to the extent that you can, whether you are, a social worker or a foster parent, a parent, doesn't matter, trying to create and teach healthy coping skills, because if young people don't have healthy ways to cope, they're going to figure out potentially an unhealthy way to cope. So to the extent that we can, finding ways to support them and give them suggestions and say, hey, it seems like you're really stressed right now. Maybe we should do this together, right? There's also this under sort of thread that I think about a lot around just connection, because we're social beings, because we're hardwired for connection. Sometimes just being with people, and people that we trust, people that we care about, can be a really, really helpful thing, to help us feel safe, to help us feel better. Laughing is also a quick thing too. I'm giving y'all lots of things, but it's because I know everything doesn't work for everybody. So if you can find a way to laugh with your teens too, that'll help. So and I'm just making sure y'all will get access to the slides. Taylor, I'm gonna send you the slides too. As well as childhood, naming emotions. I love this. We stress this in early childhood, naming and identifying emotions. Yep. Okay, perfect. Good. Let me check the questions real quick. The name of the Brene Brown book is Atlas of the Heart. It's like it's big, but it's great. And it's like, really, if you work with people, you should get it. So answer that. Okay, perfect. So now, and I'm going to speed myself up just a little bit, because as you all can tell, I could talk about this, I think, literally all day. The next thing I'm going to give you is another framework. I can get to it. And it's about activating our reward response, right? And sort of decreasing the activity in our limbic system. It's called SCARF, and I use this one a lot because it's easy to remember. I first learned about it in my doctoral program, and I've never forgotten it because it has an acronym. So I'm going to explain it, and then we're going to sort of go through each section, and then I'm going to answer the last few questions, and then we'll let you go, and I'll make sure you have my contact information, and as well as Hillary knows all the ways to find you. So SCARF was introduced several years ago, I think probably 10 or 15 years ago, by a man named David Rock. And he has sort of helped to found, if you will, and name and articulate this concept called neuro leadership, which is the intersection of neuroscience and leadership. And so he has spent, there's the neuro leadership has a great website. They have conferences, they have great resources, they have a podcast. If you just Google Neuro Leadership Institute, but they have created this framework that helps to sort of I'll describe it as a framework that captures the common factors that can activate a reward response or threat response in social situations. So this is really around social situations, because I feel like if we can help our young people regulate their emotions in and of themselves, whether they're with somebody or not, that's a really important skill. But then I also feel like we need to find ways to help them in the context of a social group, right? So everything on this sort of SCARF model is around decreasing threat, increasing reward. And it's all completely backed by neuroscience. So the 5 of them, and then I'm going to go sort of step by step. Go back. Well, we'll see. I can leave it here. It's all over the place. My slides hate me today. So the first one is status. Hold on, let me just go back. We'll get to it. The first one is status. The second one is certainty. The next one, and this will be on the slide again in a second, is autonomy. And then relatedness and fairness. So those are the 5 components of SCARF. And if you're like me and take notes, don't worry, you're going to see this quite a bit. So this is a really great image, and you'll have these slides, so you'll be able to go back and look at this. But the first one, and I'm gonna leave this here for just a second. I'm gonna keep going to the next slides because I have a slide for each one of them. But the first one is around status. Am I valuable? Am I valued? Certainty. Do I know what's going to happen? Or do I know where I stand in this situation? Autonomy. Do I have choice? Relatedness is around belonging, and do I feel like I'm a part of this team? Do I feel like people are, care about me? And then the last one is fairness. Do I feel like I'm being treated fairly? So we're going to first talk about status. And again, status is about relative importance to others. So do I perceive that my contribution, whether it is an actual, like I'm saying words, I'm providing something, or just my contribution, my physical presence, do I feel like it is valued? And this can, there's a lot of ways that sort of status can show up. I see it a lot actually in organizations, and when we sort of attach titles to things, I sort of see it sometimes show up that way. But status can also show up in social groups. It can show up in families as well, right? It can show up in the classroom. By golly, it can show up in the classroom. It can even show up if, in the context of a relationship with a social worker or a therapist, right? Or a CASA, or a guardian ad litem. Do I feel like this person values me? Some ways, because I'm going to give you some real tactical things too. Some ways to help make somebody feel like they have more status in the relationship, in the social setting, is recognition, right? So providing some version of recognition. The research says it's better if you can find a way to do it publicly, if it's a public setting, right? If it's just you and your client, then you don't have to worry about it there. But if it's in like a classroom setting, as an example, or like a mentor group, but providing recognition. So folks, they have heard you say, oh, thank you for, you are good at this, right? Or thank you for, you have done this thing well. The other thing is gratitude, and saying like, thank you, I am appreciative that you are here, right? Expressing that verbally is really helpful. One of the things that it also says is this idea of spending quality time with someone, and just spending that time. And if you think about it, it's like, especially with adults and teens, because I think, because I don't know, because we all have too much going on. Sometimes as adults, we can feel like we're not giving enough attention to the young people in our lives. But if we're able to just sort of set aside some time to them, it can sort of create a message of it. I am important enough that you are intentionally building time for me, right? One of the other real practical things, and this is going to be on the list of resources I send you. Y'all going to be like, she's sending us a lot of stuff, and I am, because I think it's all really good. One of the other things that came up when I was researching SCARF for young people, right, and how it shows up in young people in particular, is your tone of voice is important, right? And the sort of the ways that the more subtle, nuanced ways that we are communicating to somebody around their status. So our tone of voice, our body language, how are we sort of physically showing up? That can also help somebody to feel like, am I valued? Am I not valued? Right? So as you're thinking about your young people and the way that you're teaching and supporting them, think about status, right? What is the relative importance? Do I feel like I'm important? The next one is certainty, which concerns the ability to predict the future. I think I mentioned this, but the brain doesn't really like gaps in information, uncertainty. This is part of the myriad of reasons why we're still dealing with the impacts of COVID, because for many of us, I think probably all of us, there was a big old lot of uncertainty during COVID. Both, when is this going to be over? When is life going to feel normal again? But I also feel like, anybody who worked with young people, especially parents, were having a hard time. So like, do I send my kid back to school? Is that an option? There's just a lot going on. And our brain doesn't like too much uncertainty. And it can make us feel, again, like there's fear, like we have a threat response when there's too much uncertainty. So do I know what's going to happen next? And there are a lot of ways to support young people in creating a sense of certainty, to the extent possible, having some version of a routine, right? So if you are a CASA and you visit your young person, you visit your kid every month, are there consistent things, even just the consistency of, you will see me next month, right? Like that is a certain thing. The other thing is with young people, and we all know this, but to the extent possible, you should do what you say you're going to do. Or if you can't, something happened, I can't come this month, let them know as soon as you can, because it can make them feel certainly like a status thing, like, oh, they don't care about me, and they're not coming because they don't care, even though that's probably not the case at all. But also it can help them feel like certain, like this thing is going to happen. So to the extent possible, having a routine. The other thing that I think is particularly helpful with young people is having clear and predictable and communicated expectations, right? Like, have I been clear with you around what the expectation is? If you're going to go out tonight with your friends, have I been clear about what time you need to come home? Right. Or, if, even in the context of maybe a therapy session, have we been clear around the expectations of each other in this setting? Right. So that's one way to build uncertainty. In addition to routine, some other things are, to the extent that you can, providing an update about what's going to happen next. That's also true for folks who are neurodivergent, particularly folks who are autistic. The ability to know what's coming, it can decrease stress a lot. So again, to the extent that you can, say, hey, by the way, this thing is happening next. Or, next week, this is going to happen. Autonomy provides a sense of control over events. Do I have a say? Which is an interesting thing, particularly around working with teenagers, because I think in my experience, this is where they want more autonomy because, and again, we're sort of, biology says we're sort of trying to prep them to be able to be adults, to be on their own, right? And so the ability to make some decisions and say, this is what I want to have happen is actually sort of an important part of this developmental process. So to the extent possible, can you provide choice? I feel like elementary school teachers have been like really good about this, or at least intentional about it for a really long time. But even if you're, only giving them two options, right? Because sometimes you can't, you don't have the ability to give them multiple choices, right? So, even if you can say, hey, do you want to do this or this, right? Do you want to, do you want us to meet when next time I come back? Do you want us to meet during lunch or after school? Right, to just be able to give them a little bit of voice in the process. The other thing I've experienced, just it's the same sort of with adults, it is much easier to buy into a process or to something if you've had some version of a say in it. The other thing is trying to the extent possible also to like find a middle ground, right? So especially if you're a parent, right, and you're like, your curfew's 11, and the young person's like, I need it to be 1. And this is sort of a fun example. It can apply to other things. Is there the ability, right, if it makes sense, to sort of find a way to say, okay, maybe it's going to be this, right? So that they have sort of a say, and they have some version of they're part of this process in one way, shape, or form. Relatedness is a sense of safety with others. Are we in this together? It's belonging, right? It's community, it's relationship, and that certainly goes back to the fact that we are social beings, right? And so, there are many ways, many ways to sort of focus on relatedness. That a few things I said around status can help. So providing some sort of like appreciation or recognition to say like, essentially a version of I care about you, I see you, I value you, I'm hearing what you're saying. And so again, spending time together. The other thing that can be really helpful with this is like asking young people what they're interested in, and to the extent that you can, like, being interested in one way, shape, or form. So whether that means, if you are a social worker and your young person always talks about video games, ask them about it next time they come in, right? Or if you are a guardian ad litem, go to one of their sports games or go to one of their things, right? So that they feel like this person actually cares about me. And I will tell you the other sort of quick thing that I don't have time to elaborate on, because I would talk about it forever, is that we are seeing a rise in loneliness across the board. I don't exclusively blame COVID. It certainly had an impact on it, but the U.S. Surgeon General has called loneliness an epidemic, and I'm seeing it so much with adults. But what the research says is that loneliness is impacting young people as well, for all sorts of reasons. So, to really double down on relatedness on this, relationship piece can help their brains not be so stressed out, but it can also help them from a perspective of loneliness. And then the last part of this particular framework or model is fairness. Do I perceive that these exchanges are fair, right? Do I believe that, this person is doing what is good and right? And I feel like the thing that I feel like I hear from young people a lot when they're frustrated about things is this doesn't feel fair, right? I feel like that's the thing I hear a lot from them. So some ways to sort of help with fairness are around understanding expectations, and similar to certainty, right? That one of the things I love about this model is sometimes one thing can hit on multiple things, right? So if I do one thing, it may really help me. It may help in a few different ways to help me feel less stressed, less anxious. But being clear around expectations and then following through on those, right? So especially, like if you are working with multiple young people at a time, maybe you're a teacher and you say this is the expectation, but if you let 5 people do whatever they want to do on the side over here, and the other 5 students see that, they're going to think pretty intensely that this isn't fair, right? So being clear around expectations and following through on them. To the extent that you can be consistent, again, similar to certainty, if I'm going to come see you every month, right, that can sort of, again, help it feel a little bit fair in our brains because we know what's coming, what's happening. Another one that I think is really helpful is recognition when expectations are met, or when something sort of when a young person does something good, right? So I am so thankful and proud of you, or whatever word sort of you use, whatever feels right to you, that you did this thing, or gosh, like we talked about, you would work really hard on math, and you would, work hard and try to do better. And I'm really proud of you. I see you're trying. So, trying to sort of provide that recognition, again, that also helps with relatedness and with status. And the other thing that I think is helpful to know about this framework is that because from its core, right, it was created with the brain in mind, although it wasn't created with teenagers in mind. I think it applies in so many ways. All of these underlying things of status and certainty and autonomy and fairness and relatedness, at the core of them, especially if you try to put them together, they're going to, again, decrease activity in the limbic system to the extent that we can, increase activity in the prefrontal cortex, and help us to create space between stimulus and reaction. And because we know our young people still have this part of the brain developing, one of the first things that we need to do is try to keep activity in the limbic system managed. And sometimes they need to have a big response, right? Sometimes things happen and it makes sense that you have a big sort of response. But to the extent possible, if we can keep that part of the brain at least a little bit more sort of managed and in control, it frees all of us up to help teach them the skills up here, to help teach them how to plan, how to prioritize, how to organize, right? You can go to Google, you can go to ChatGPT and say, how do I teach a young person how to plan? We can figure that out. But a young person is going to have a really hard time planning and thinking into the future and prioritizing if their emotions are taking up their entire brain and their prefrontal cortex is sort of over here in a corner and not even paying attention, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why this framework is really, really helpful. And then the other thing I'll say about it before I move on is the way that I practically use this framework, and mostly with adults, although I think it's sort of the same, is when I'm in social situations, particularly in situations where there's been either some drama or some things happening, right? So either in those situations or a new situation, right? I may sort of think through, okay, how can I make sure that they feel a level of status, right? Okay, perfect, cool. How can I, do I have the ability to have sort of any certainty or, even at the end of a meeting, hey, this thing is going to happen, right? So like at the end of this, I'll say, oh, I'm going to send Hillary these things. There's a level of the ability to protect, at some point, it'll probably be on Monday, you'll get something in your inbox, right? So that thinking about it that way. Autonomy, can I give them choice at all? Does that work? Relatedness, fairness. So I almost use them as a checklist, right? The other way that I sometimes use this framework is if things are happening that don't always either make sense or I can't put my hand on like what's going on here. I may say, do I think any of these things are at play? Do I think, oh, you know what? I bet that they feel like this isn't really fair, right? And then I can just work on that. Because the other thing is I've given you a lot of things today, but everything isn't going to feel right and true to all of you, and everything isn't going to work for every single situation. So know that I'm giving you a bunch of things so that you can sort of have this toolkit and say, oh, my young person is doing this. Or the other thing that is I know that I need to shift and show up differently for this in this situation. Like if I just got into an argument with my partner and I'm about to go into a therapy session with a young person, I probably need to regulate myself pretty quickly so that I can also engage. So these tools can help with that too. So I'm going to go through, just make sure I'm not missing anything quickly because I know I have about 2 minutes. Okay. Perfect. And then I'm going to quickly see to make sure are there any questions that I can't answer? And then I might be like 2 minutes over, Hillary, but don't worry, I'm going to make sure we get out of here. So how does stress impact the ability of the prefrontal cortex to continue to function normally, and can it return to normal? So stress plays a number on our body and our brain, and certainly both parts of the brain. And so what I would recommend around, sort of helping to, regulate our brain, our prefrontal cortex, is a lot of the things that I mentioned, because really this idea of helping our prefrontal cortex in the long term is, I think, 2 steps. So first, we've got to deal with it in the short term. So we've got to decrease the stress and decrease the way that our body is feeling stress, because chronic stress really will wear your body out, right? And then then we can sort of focus on the future and focus on sort of working on this prefrontal cortex. And there are some sort of strategies. Honestly, deep breathing and meditation are a really big one because they decrease activity in your limbic system in a consistent way. But then the other thing I would recommend is some of those prefrontal cortex skills I talked about, those executive functioning skills. teaching those and practicing those can help to strengthen the connections in this part of the brain, because the brain also is the type of organ where if you strengthen it, if you use it over and over again, it's stronger, right? So it's a two-part function, Megan. So pushing, to Megan's question, pushing down sort of the activity in the limbic system so that we actually have the ability to do anything, and then practicing these skills up front. And then ACEs understands the brain of a young person who is experiencing significant trauma is smaller. Can the amygdala grow or be repaired? So funny enough, I feel like my answers are all the same, but the research that I've seen says a few things. That the research I've seen around trauma and the amygdala is that it makes it more sort of jittery, is sometimes the word I describe. And so the ways to deal with that, primarily in the long term, are deep breathing, because it really does actually like physically impact the limbic system, the amygdala. But then the other thing that I would say over time is if you can sort of do that, and also, yeah, I mean, it's really a lot of these same things. So if you can sort of do a lot of deep breathing, do a lot of that, like nervous system regulation is also another sort of topic I've been doing quite a bit of research around. So if you also sort of help regulate the nervous system, that's another session. Hillary, we can talk about me doing that one too if you wanted to. But if you can sort of help regulate the nervous system, that's going to help with that activity in the limbic system. And yes, the amygdala and sort of your larger brain and nervous system it doesn't stop changing. And so part of why we need things like these sessions, we need counseling, we need interventions, is because those interventions actually can help, right? So I'm going to make sure I'm not missing any other big questions. And you all can, if you have follow-up questions, you can email them to Hillary. You can also email them to me. I'm going to give you my email in a second. I know it's 3:30, so I'm going to go through this next slide very, very, very quickly. But in short, we talked about this. This is just a summary. Teen brain is developing quite a bit. And supporting teens, really, it's going to look like helping them to understand and regulate their emotions, and helping them to feel safe, which is all of those things around SCARF, helping them to feel, decrease our threat response, increase our reward response. The other thing I'll say quickly is increasing that reward response really also helps with dopamine, and it's like a natural way to get dopamine. So it is a better sort of way to get dopamine for the brain. So my question to you, my homework question to you, you don't need to answer it, but how will you use this content to engage with teens differently? And then here's some references I've used, and I'll probably beef this up a little bit since I'm going to send it to you all so that you all know what you're clicking on, versus when I do it in sessions like this, I'm like, here, these are just some links. Here's my email, and my website if you want to have sort of follow-up questions. And I know we're done, but I'm going to go through and just make sure there are not any burning questions, because we still have a few folks on. So, okay, perfect. No like big questions. And I think I've answered all the questions that are in the chat. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So I'm happy to stay on for another minute or two if folks have additional questions that they want to put in the chat or in the actual Q&A. But other than that, I'm all done. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. You are amazing, as always. So we're all like chit-chattering through the office of all the things that you need to come back and do. Just
Well,
love
I'm
you.
always
Yeah.
happy to virtually be with y'all in West Virginia. Always,
I love
always.
it. We so appreciate you. What let's see. You did so good keeping up with everything.
I tried to.
You
Sometimes there are
did.
gifts of my brain working so quick, and this is one of them. And hopefully I've answered the questions that were in the chat. Hopefully I've sort of answered them in a complete enough way that,
Okay.
that folks feel like they're good. But feel free to, you all can, email me if you've got follow-up questions. But yeah,
Girl, it's gonna be me and all of the questions.
that's fine too. That works for me just fine too.
Yes, the surveys, the evaluation, everything's gonna be emailed out next week. Keep in mind we're holidaying and we're checking out for a couple of days at just in a few minutes. So guys, look for everything next week. Oh, hi, Oregon.
And I know somebody asked, a few people have asked, so I'm going to put my email in the chat function
Okay.
because I know a few folks have asked. You know what? I'll type it here as well.
So look at my face, like right up on the screen there, because I can't see the screen to read. All right, it looks like our numbers are ticking down slowly. And congratulations on Houston. That's exciting.
Thank you. It's a fun place to be. It really is.
I've only been there for the airport, but
Right.
it looks
I went.
fun.
I And it's not a bad airport. It's funny. I was in Detroit like a month ago, and I was in the airport and then stayed in the airport hotel. So I was like, I basically was in the airport in Detroit.
Yes.
I wasn't even in the city.
Yes.
So same.
Same. Mhm. All right. Well, I think we're good. Thank you to everybody who's still on, who joined us today. We appreciate you. Look for more. Like I said, we're trying to do monthly webinars again. So look for those coming up. You'll get all of your information next week. If anybody has any questions, just email us at mission. Trying to read. Sorry. I think we're good.
I think we're good too. So I'll just send a follow-up email and it'll be either tonight or tomorrow with the slides. And then I want to make sure I sort of curate this list because I have a whole
Mhm.
bunch of like, random little things here and there.
Listen,
So,
and my questions from last week do you ever sleep? Because
oh,
you
I
are like,
do.
oh,
Oh, I do. Right
you are
now I'm
on
mostly
it.
on like 7 hours, but I normally try to get 8.
Because we had emailed and then like you sent me a reply so early one morning and I was
Oh, I
like,
do. I have idea.
sleep.
Oh, and then I mean, this everybody will hear this, but is the book that you're reading, what is it called?
That was too funny. It's something really cheesy.
No, First Lies Win?
No.
No,
Super
okay.
cheesy, Kindle Unlimited, like cheapo free book.
Well, because I
But I
feel
just
like I
got
had read
so
that
tickled
somewhere.
last night.
That is so, I mean, it's really actually very funny. For those of you who are Salon, Hillary's reading a book and one of the characters' names is Jessica Sharp. And I like laughed out loud and I didn't respond because I was like laughing and then I think I got
No,
distracted. But there's
it
another
was
Jessica
random.
Sharp in Greenville. So I was like, that is
Oh,
so, isn't that wild? I
yeah,
used to, when I was
that is
still in
funny.
Greenville, I would get her mail and she would sometimes get my emails because our lives overlapped. So I really did. I sort of
Oh,
was like tickled pink
that's
when I saw
funny.
that email.
I just thought I was like, what a coincidence. Like this book
Right.
pops up
Especially
and I
that you're
was
reading
gonna be
it right now.
yeah, right now, and I see you today.
Well, I enjoyed it. I might have to ask you to send me the name of the book so I can read it. Add it to my list because I like all the books. Give me all of them.
Check what's when you get the certificates. Okay, and you take their dad. Here.
I think we're good. I have so many ADHD questions for you though. We were
Well,
asking
you
that
know where
too.
to
We're
find
like,
me.
do you have like do you do that in your service? Like in your
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Oh yeah, you
Well,
know where to find me. Yeah,
I'll be finding you.
I
I
know.
have so
Yeah,
many
I'll
questions.
well and I'll send you. Yeah, I mean, really, email me.
Mm.
I'm
I
always
loved
happy to
all of
help.
that connection. Like this whole session has just connected so much for me. It was just
Oh,
really good.
that's so good. Well, yeah, and I'll send you some thoughts when I send you my follow-up email.
All right, it
Perfect.
keeps ticking down. I don't see any
Yeah,
questions, so I'll let
I
you
think we're
go.
probably good. All right,
Have a
perfect. Well, I'll
good
send
weekend.
you a
Happy
follow-up email
Easter.
tomorrow. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you. You too. All
Mhm. All right.
right.
Thank you, Jessica. I
Bye.
appreciate you. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.